Why is it that after receiving more than $1.4 trillion in foreign aid, Africa is still incredibly poor? This continent has received more foreign aid than any other place in the world. But what exactly do they have to show for all of this money? Sadly, it turns out that 350 million Africans still don't have clean water. 43% of the continent is still without electricity, and the number of people living on less than $2 a day has actually grown from 280 million in 1990 to more than 430 million people today. Even more bizarre is the fact that the rest of the world seems to be leaving Africa behind. While the number of people in Africa living in absolute poverty has grown over the last 30 years, that number has fallen dramatically across the rest of the world. It used to be 1.9 billion people living in such poverty in 1990, and now it's dropped to 736 million today. So the question remains, why does Africa still look like this, even after more than $1 trillion has been thrown at the continent over the last 7 decades? According to one report from the World Bank, an astonishing 75% of foreign aid projects designed to improve Africa's agricultural industry were failures. And some programs actually made the situation worse. In the 1970s, Operation Milis Mopti aimed to boost grain production in Mali, but instead resulted in a government-imposed pricing system that triggered an 80% collapse in production. In Senegal, one foreign aid program spent $4 million to increase the number of cattle in the country's Bakel department from 11,000 to 25,000. Instead, the number of livestock only grew by 900. And these are just a couple examples of hundreds of billions of dollars spent on foreign aid projects over the last several decades. In fact, the failure of African foreign aid programs has become so apparent that YouTubers now have a much better track record of delivering on results instead of government agencies. Once more, other countries, which were also former colonies themselves, have received little to no foreign aid, but are actually doing much better than their African counterparts. Take Singapore and Senegal as examples. Both were former colonies that gained independence in the 1960s. Today, Singapore has surpassed its former colonizer in wealth despite existing on a tiny island with virtually no natural resources. In contrast to this vast wealth, Senegal remains one of the most impoverished nations on earth despite receiving billions in foreign aid since its independence. The stark contrast raises a crucial question. What did Singapore do so differently that led it to become so much richer than Senegal? Well, not becoming a socialist dictatorship probably helped, because at the same time that nations like Singapore embraced free market principles, at one point, 20 nations across Africa identified as Marxist-Leninist or socialist states. These governments spent decades exerting extensive control over their economies, hindering growth, and driving a cycle of poverty that exists to this day. Ultimately, the people of Africa are not poor because they lack natural resources or don't have enough foreign aid. It's because their governments chose policies that kept them poor. More than 30 years after the collapse of Africa's Marxist bloc, many countries across the continent continue to democratically pursue the exact same authoritarian policies that kept their nations in poverty. These governments continue to centrally plan their economies and the lives of their citizens, restricting the ability of Africans to creatively problem solve, trade goods and services between each other freely, and pursue prosperity independent of the whims of a corrupt elite political class that rules over them. But what does any of that have to do with foreign aid? Well, it's actually twofold. By propping up failing governments, you allow the people creating the problem the ability to stay in power, since they are often the ones helping to control how aid is distributed. And 2, random infusions of foreign cash and goods can make it incredibly difficult for local entrepreneurs to develop domestic industries. In short, far from helping, foreign aid is in many cases exacerbating the problem, as Africans desperately trying to climb out of poverty are constantly knocked down by their own governments with the help of foreign dollars.